Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be talking about the polling that has come out so far in a potential Biden versus Trump rematch. And obviously right now that is the matchup that is expected for this 2024 election. I think most of us are predicting Donald Trump to win the GOP nomination and Joe Biden to maintain the support of the Democratic Party. And so in the event of a Biden versus Trump rematch, what would we see? And I know I have my predictions for this. Go check those out if you haven't already. Go watch my videos. I've talked a lot about this matchup, and I'm going to be talking a lot about it for the next year. But in terms of from a polling standpoint, what can we look at? And it's interesting because right now, Donald Trump is ahead by 2% in the polls, and that was not the case in 2016 when he won. It was certainly not the case in 2020 when he lost. And so why is he leading now? And is it bad news for Joe Biden? Should Democrats be worried? And should Republicans be putting stock into this? So I want to talk about that today, do a little bit of poll analysis, but more specifically focus on the dynamics of the electorate. So right now in RCP, Trump has an average lead of 2%. He was, in most recent polls, up by 6 in Harvard-Harris. Again, a lot of undecideds, but, still a 6-point lead is nothing to, sneeze at. Economist YouGov had him tied. Quinnipiac had him down 4. Economist YouGov had him down 3. Quinnipiac had him down 2. But Harvard-Harris seems to be really bullish on him, having up by 7. And so it's the same on FiveThirtyEight. They just don't have an average yet. But you'll see that when you look at the Trump versus Biden polls, he's up by 7 in Harris. He's up by 6 in this other one. I don't know why they posted this one after, but he's up by 7 and 6 in these polls. And there's other matchups too between Biden and Christie, Biden and DeSantis, Biden and Haley. But in the Biden versus Trump matchups, we're seeing Trump has an average lead of just under 2%. And so that to me is a warning sign for Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden is still favored to win this election, and I've been saying that for a while now. But he has a 41% approval rating. He's not charismatic. He's not particularly popular. He's also not someone that I think is positioned to make any potential comebacks. Now, he has shown he's a good politician, right? He was a senator for an eternity, and he is the president of the United States. And so to do that, you have to be a good politician. And I'm sure Joe Biden has a strategy. But when you're down in the polls and you are not really showing any signs of enthusiasm, again, his primary opponents, a lot of the people in those polls that are supporting RFK Jr. or Marianne Williamson, they're not, progressives. Some of them are progressives, but a lot of them are moderate Democrats. And so that's a warning sign for Biden for sure. And when you see his approval continuing to slip, when you see the fact that he's trailing Trump in polling, that's not good. Now, obviously, polls can be inaccurate, and I think Joe Biden knows that better than anyone. In 2020, the polls had him roughly tied in Texas, Ohio, and Iowa, all of which he lost by over 5%. They had him outside the margin of error in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, as well as Arizona. And he won all those states, but he won all of them by 1.2 at the most. And in the case of Arizona, it was the closest state in terms of raw vote margin. And so the polls have historically overstated support for Democrats. In 2016 and in 2020, we saw polling suggest Democrats were in a better position in almost every state than they actually were. In fact, the only state in 2020, the only state where Joe Biden actually outperformed his polling average on FiveThirtyEight was Colorado. That was it. The other 49 states, he either performed evenly or underperformed. And that includes every swing state, even including the ones he won. So in 2020, the polls put Biden in a better position than he was actually in. And on election night, and I guess on November 7th, when we officially saw the race call, we knew that Biden had won, but that it was not a landslide that some of the polls were predicting. And so that is I think, a dynamic that a lot of people seem to forget, but it's important. The second thing I want to say is kind of the opposite, and it's that in 2022, the polls overstated Republican support. They had Dr. Oz beating John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. They had Adam Laxalt beating Kathleen Cortez Masto pretty handily in Nevada. And in Georgia, they were back and forth, but I believe on Election Day, Herschel Walker was ahead. The only Senate race where the polls actually had Democrats favored was Arizona, which they won pretty easily, actually. They won by over 5%, or by just under 5% with Mark Kelly. And we saw a similar thing in gubernatorial races. The polls, a lot of them did not expect Democrats almost none of them actually had them winning Arizona. Katie Hobbs was, a pretty real underdog in that race, and she ended up winning. Most polls did not expect Democrats to hold on to Wisconsin, especially because the polls in Wisconsin had historically been very biased towards Democrats. In fact, in 2020, they had Biden up by over 7, and he won by 0.6. So they overshot him by almost 7%. And then in 2022, they had a close race with Tim Michaels narrowly leading Tony Evers. So almost everyone thought, myself included, to be fair, that Tim Michaels was going to beat Tony Evers. That did not happen. And they also showed close races in Michigan, in New Mexico, in Oregon, and even in states like New York, which, to be fair, New York ended up being fairly close. But the polls almost all across the board in 2022 overstated Republican support. And they did that mostly because after the polls were so horrible in 2020, pollsters were like, look, we're not trying to go out of business here. How can we fix these polls? How can we make them actually reflect the electorate in a way that gives us credibility? And so what they did was they would have samples and they'd make them more conservative. So they'd have whiter samples than the actual electorate, or they'd have the samples be less college educated. And they'd call these voters and they'd say who you're going to vote for. And in 2022, obviously the samples were more Republican leaning than the actual electorate because, again, the electorate they showed was whiter and less college educated than the actual electorate ended up being. And on top of that, they called a lot of self-identifying independent voters that were actually Republicans. And what we saw was that independent voters in 2022 said, we're voting for Republicans, but on election day they broke for Democrats because, again, samples that the polls were producing were not accurate. And so this is all to say the polls are horrible, and I think we know that, but we don't really have a judgment because if this happened pre-2022, I would have said Biden's in a lot of trouble because in 2020, the polls had him up by a lot more than he ended up winning by, and if he's down, he's going to lose by even more. But because of the events that unfolded in 2022, I can't really, make a definitive call. I think we should stick more to our feelings about the electorate than, the polls. And so that's kind of why I want to look at this possibility but not make it my actual prediction. So I'm going to fill out a map. I'm not going to endorse it, but this is what you would expect in an environment that Trump would win by 2%. And it's not going to be good for Joe Biden because he would be winning, most of the Clinton states in 2016. But what we'd see is that if we saw a 6% swing nationwide, because again, he won the popular vote by 4.5 in 2020. If he won it by 1.8, that would be a 6.2% swing towards Donald Trump. And we would likely see Republicans win back a lot of these competitive states. And so that is obviously very bad for Joe Biden, but it also kind of shows us the upside that Donald Trump has if he were to win the popular vote. So I think we're just going to fill out this map again. This is not my actual prediction, so please do not freak out if this is not necessarily what you agree with, but this is what I think we would see if we were to get an environment that favored Donald Trump by 2% nationwide. Because again, even in 2016 when he won, he did not win the popular vote by 2%. He actually lost it by 2%. And so if we were to see a scenario in which Joe Biden won the popular vote, this is likely what our electoral map would be, give or take a couple of states. I think Michigan would be really close too, but this map, if Biden were to lose the popular vote by, 2%, this is basically what a Trump best case scenario would look like. Maybe he'd win Michigan or Minnesota in the best case scenario, but this is a really good map for Donald Trump. And so this is what the polls are saying right now. Now, do I believe it? No. I think Donald Trump is in a weaker position than the polls are, painting. But at the same time, we have to talk about it because in 2022, I talked about the polls. In 2020, I talked about the polls. So in 2024, we're going to talk about the polls too. And this is what they're saying if you base it off of national environment. If you want to look at state polls, we'll do that later when we get more of them. We only have a couple state polls for Trump versus Biden. But right now, Biden's down 2% nationally. That's really bad for him. And if it continues, I think he should hit the panic button. Right now, it's early. Polls, a lot of undecided voters that could break towards Biden. But right now, this is what I think we're looking at if you take the polls, word for word. So, not my prediction, but I just want to share it with you guys. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like. Tell me what you think is going to happen in the comments down below. Make your early 2024 predictions so we can see who's right next year. And I'll see you all in the next one.